Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Our country deserves an asylum system which offers the public confidence that the government is in control of it, which is fair and consistent, and which is based on showing compassion to those who are fleeing for their lives. The legislation before us today not only fails to meet those basic principles, it also fails to address the specific challenges that we're facing. It will not deter dangerous journeys across the English Channel, and indeed the Anti-Slavery Commissioner and top police chief have said repeatedly that this bill will make it harder, not easier, to prosecute people smugglers. And it will not tackle the 12,000-long queue of loyal to Britain Afghan refugees who are currently languishing in hotels, alongside a further 25,000 asylum seekers at an eye-watering cost of £4.7 million to the British taxpayer daily. This is frankly a shameful state of affairs that is exacting an awful cost on communities and placing an enormous financial burden on the taxpayer. And it's caused by this Home Secretary, on whose watch we have seen a staggering 60% drop in processed claims. Mr. Deputy Speaker, since this bill was last before this House, the amendments have of course changed, but so has the context around it. The legislation before us today must now be debated against the backdrop of the government's Rwanda offloading agreement, which was announced last week in a desperate attempt to distract attention from all the law-breaking in Downing Street. I will give way.
I thank the Shadow Minister for giving way. Could he give us a simple yes or no on whether the Labour Party support the Rwanda plan?
I can give a very simple answer that the Labour Party does not support the Rwanda plan for reasons that I'm about to set out. We on these benches therefore support all the amendments before us today that seek to mitigate the worst excesses of this profoundly inadequate and mean-spirited piece of legislation, which reflects the toxic combination of incompetence and indifference that we've come to expect from this Home Secretary. Because, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the reality is that this bill is an exercise in damage limitation, in essence an attempt by the Home Secretary to deal with the awful mess that she's been making since she was appointed in 2018. The clauses on offshoring, inadmissibility, differential treatment and offence of arrival are symptomatic of a shambolic government that has completely lost control of our asylum system, to the extent that it's now seeking to dump its problems on a developing country that's 4,000 miles away and which has a questionable record on human rights. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Rwanda offloading plan that is enabled by this bill is extortionately expensive, workable, and it is also un-British. Looking first at the price of what's being proposed, it's quite extraordinary that we're either unable to, or the Home Secretary is either unwilling or unable to provide any clarity on this point by publishing the forecast cost. But the Rwanda plan is estimated to cost in the region of £30,000 per person, and that feels optimistic. Contrast this with the £11,000 that it costs to process an asylum seeker here in the UK, and we're already starting to see the impact on the public purse. Now, the Prime Minister has said that he expects to send tens of thousands of asylum seekers to Rwanda per year. So we're looking at around £1 billion of taxpayers' money, Mr. Deputy Speaker, spent by a government that is doing nothing for British people who are being hammered by the cost of living crisis. And then there's £120 million in development aid. What precisely is that going to be spent on? Apparently, it will not go towards paying for Rwandan caseworkers. So is it just the eye-watering price the Home Secretary has paid for a press release? But don't just take my word for it, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The Home Secretary's own permanent secretary, Matthew Rycroft, stated that value for money of the policy is dependent on it being effective as a deterrent. And that evidence of a deterrent effect is highly uncertain and cannot be quantified with sufficient certainty to provide me with the necessary level of assurance over value for money. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we on these benches agree wholeheartedly with Mr. Rycroft. There is not a shred of evidence to suggest that the Rwanda plan will deter the people smugglers or the small boats, and there is therefore not a shred of evidence to demonstrate that it will deliver value for money. To understand value for money, the government must provide forecasts for a range of scenarios, and that's why we're supporting Lord's Amendment 53B. The amendment provides that in order to offshore refugees to a third state, the Secretary of State must lay regulations specifying the identity of that state and have them approved by Parliament. Before the Home Secretary may lay those regulations, costings must first be laid before both houses. It is critical that Parliament is given the opportunity to scrutinise both offshoring and offloading plans for value for money, and particularly at a time when our constituents are facing a cost of living crisis. If the Rwanda offloading agreement does not serve as a deterrent, then it's failing on its own terms, and therefore also failing to provide value for money. But there is also a chance that the scheme may not even get off the ground, as it will end up getting bogged down in the legal system. There can be absolutely no doubt that the government's claims that Rwanda is a safe country for refugees will be challenged in the courts, given that thousands of Rwandans seek asylum in Europe every year, and with 76 Rwandan citizens granted asylum here in the UK since 2017. It's also well worth noting that in 2019 Israel cancelled its offloading agreement with Rwanda after it emerged that the vast majority of refugees sent to Rwanda left within days of arriving there, and after it was revealed that they had led to immense suffering, including subjecting vulnerable people to human trafficking. It is therefore highly likely that the Rwanda offloading plan will unravel because it is both eye-wateringly expensive and workable. But, Mr. Deputy Speaker, it is also deeply un-British, because the decision to outsource our problems to a developing country halfway across the globe with a questionable record on human rights just doesn't feel right. It's just not the way we do things in this country. And this is why we're supporting a number of amendments to bring this legislation closer to reflecting our values as a nation. On these benches, we've continuously made the case that the bill must meet Britain's obligations under the 1951 UN Refugee Convention. And we are, of course, supporting Lord's Amendment 5B, which secures this. It is our country's historic commitment to offering safe haven to refugees that leads us to support a number of the other amendments that are before us today. Firstly, Lord's Amendment 6B, which seeks to ensure all refugees are given their convention rights and that family unity is maintained, even if the government are determined to introduce the utterly inappropriate differential treatment aspect of this bill, which of course shamefully contravenes the UN Convention. Secondly, Lord's Amendment 13B, which, if accepted, rather than criminalising Ukrainians and other desperate refugees who arrive here without clearance, would only criminalise those who've already been deported. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we should not be seeking to create a second class of refugee. Many of these people are desperate when they arrive on our doorstep, and the government would do well to remember that. Thirdly, we support Lord's Amendment 11B, which calls on the Home Secretary to set targets for taking in a number of refugees each year, and which would force the Home Secretary to finally do some medium-term planning rather than constantly scrambling and making it up as she goes along. Fourthly, Lord's Amendment 10B, which provides for family reunion of unaccompanied refugees in Europe. And fifthly, Lord's Amendment 25B. I will give one that.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I just wonder whether the honourable member is aware, as I am, the experience of local authorities involved in the resettlement of refugee children is that many of those, in fact a majority of those brought to the UK on the basis of reunion with family, are in fact coming straight into our care system because the relations in the UK are not able to look after them. So it does seem to me that the government is right to resist this particular point and to seek an alternative and better way of managing the resettlement of unaccompanied children to the UK.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention. I think there's two dimensions in terms of what he's questioning there. One is around the capacity and the capability here in the UK. And there are, of course, examples where family are not able to take care of children. I don't believe that those are the majority of examples. And where that is the case, of course, we need to ensure that local authorities are adequately resourced to be able to deal with that issue. And the second is that the government's approach on this, the Minister argued that it's about taking a global approach. But I think what we can clearly see is it's much more about the hostile environment, and that there is a basic mindset in the Home Office. And that is why we should not let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and that's why the amendment in the name of Lord Dubbs is absolutely the right way to go. And fifthly, Lord's Amendment 25B, which seeks to undo the government's unlawful bid to, in effect, criminalise modern slavery victims who've been pushed into crime by human traffickers. We're clear that only criminals who've committed serious public order offences, such as terrorism or indeed other serious offences, as established via a government consultation, should have their protection withdrawn. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Home Secretary is desperately trying to clean up the mess that she's been making since 2018, rolling the dice on an extortionately expensive, unworkable and deeply un-British proposal. Instead of dreaming up headline-grabbing announcements and pie-in-the-sky ideas, she should instead be listening to the opposition's sensible and practical solutions. Firstly, the Home Secretary needs to invest to save, as the Honourable Gentleman, the Chair of the Justice Select Committee, so correctly pointed out earlier, hiring more caseworkers, investing in the court system so that we can process applications quickly and dramatically reduce the ludicrous £4.7 million a day that is currently being wasted on housing refugees in expensive hotels. Secondly, on the small boats crossings, rather than dreaming up unworkable gimmicks, the Home Secretary should be focused on engaging constructively with France and the European Union by negotiating a returns agreement and building effective security cooperation to combat the people smugglers. Rather than constantly seeking cheap headlines in the Daily Mail, as this government likes to do, Labour would use its stronger relationship with our European neighbours to reset the UK-France relationship and engage constructively to negotiate a robust migration and security agreement with the European Union. And we would, of course, legislate to prevent people smugglers from using social media to advertise their services, a Labour amendment the government shamefully rejected early in the passage of this bill. Mr. Deputy Speaker, a lot has been said about the Rwanda announcement being timed to distract from Partygate. But it's just as likely this announcement was to distract from the litany of failure that has come to define the tenure of this Home Secretary. Over 200,000 people offered their homes to Ukrainians, and somehow the Home Secretary managed to turn this story of inspiring British generosity into a bureaucratic nightmare. 12,000 Afghans who so loyally and bravely served our country are now languishing in hotels. We owe them a debt of gratitude, and yet the Home Secretary has treated them with contempt. We have a passport office in meltdown, with delays ruining the well-earned Easter breaks of hard-working British families who've been through so much over the last few years. And now we have the spectacle of this extortionate, unworkable and profoundly un-British Rwanda cash for offloading plan. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Home Secretary certainly has a mountain to climb if she wishes to regain the trust of the British people. But if she were to instruct honourable members opposite to join us in supporting these amendments this evening, then that would at least be a start. Thank you.
Ian Duncan Smith.
Mr.